Good day sa lahat and welcome uli sa ating board exam review. Ngayon ay pag-uusapan na naman natin ang abnormal psychology para sa ating board exam. And since ready ka na, let's start. Abnormal psychology review questions. Number 1. Which of the following statements about global development delay is true? A. The diagnosis is typically made in children younger than 5 years of age. B. The etiology can usually be determined. C. The prevalence is estimated to be between 0.5% and 2%. Letter D. The condition is progressive. Letter E. The condition does not generally occur with other neurodevelopmental disorder. Number 2. A 3.5-year-old girl with a history of lead exposure and a seizure disorder demonstrates substantial delays across multiple domains of functioning, including communication, learning, attention, and motor development, which limit her ability to interact with same-age peers and requires substantial support in all activities of daily living at home. Unfortunately, her mother is an extremely poor historian and the child has received no formal psychological or learning evaluation to date. She is about to be evaluated for readiness to attend preschool. What is the most common or most appropriate diagnosis? Letter A. Major neurocognitive disorder. B. Developmental coordination disorder. C. Autism spectrum disorder. D. Global developmental delay. And letter E. Specific learning disorder. Number 3. A 5-year-old boy has difficulty making friends and problems with initiating and sustaining back and forth conversation, reading social cues, and sharing his feelings with others. He makes good eye contact, has normal speech intonation, displays facial gestures, and has a range of affect that generally seem appropriate to the situation. He demonstrates an interest in trains that seems abnormal in intensity and focus. He engages in little imaginative or symbolic play. Which of the following diagnostic requirements for autism spectrum disorder are not met in this case? A. Deficit in social emotional reciprocity. B. Deficit in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social situation or interaction. Letter C. Deficits in developing and maintaining relationship. Letter D. Restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities as manifested by symptoms in two of the specified 4 categories. Or letter E. Symptoms with onset in early childhood that cause clinically significant impairment. Number 4. Which of the following statements about the development and course of autism spectrum disorder or ASD is false? Is it A? Symptoms of ASD are typically recognized during the second year of life or 12 to 24 months of age. B. Symptoms of ASD are usually not noticeable until 5 to 6 years of age or later. C. First symptoms frequently involve delayed language development, often accompanied by lack of social interest or unusual social interaction. Letter D. ASD is not a degenerative disorder and is typically for learning and compensation to continue throughout life. Or letter E. Because many normally developing young children have strong preference and enjoy repetition, distinguishing restricted and repetitive behaviors that are diagnostic of ASD can be difficult in preschooler. Number 5. Which of the following was a criterion symptom for autistic disorder in DSM-4 that was eliminated from the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder in DSM-5? Is it A, stereotype or restrictive patterns of interest? B, stereotype and repetitive motor mannerism? Letter C, inflexible adherence to routines? Letter D, persistent preoccupation with parts of objects? Or letter E, none of the above? Number 6, a 7-year-old girl presents with a history of normal language skills, vocabulary and grammar intact, but is unable to use language in a socially pragmatic manner to share ideas and feelings. She has never made good eye contact and she has difficulty reading social cues. Consequently, she has had difficulty making friends, which is further complicated by her being somewhat obsessed with cartoon characters, which she repetitively scripts. She tends to excessively smell objects because she insists on wearing the same shirt and shorts every day. Regardless of the season, getting dressed is a difficult activity. These symptoms date from early childhood and cause significant impairment in her functioning. What diagnosis best fits the child's presentation? Is it A, Asperger's disorder? B, autism spectrum disorder? C, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, or NOS? Letter D, social or pragmatic communication disorder? Or letter E, Rett syndrome? Number 7, which of the following is not representative of the typical developmental course for autism spectrum disorder? Is it A, lack of degenerative course? B, behavioral deterioration during adolescence? C, continued learning and compensation throughout life? Letter D, marked presence of early symptoms in early childhood or early school years with developmental gains in later childhood in areas such as social interaction? Or letter E, good psychosocial functioning in adulthood as indexed by independent living and gainful employment? Number 8, a 15-year-old boy has a long history of nonverbal communication deficit. As an infant, he was unable to follow someone else directing his attention by pointing. As a toddler, he was not interested in sharing events, feelings, or games with his parents. From school age into adolescence, his speech was odd in tonality and phrasing, and his body language was awkward. What do these symptoms represent? Is it A, stereotypies? B, restricted range of interest? C, developmental regression? D, prodromal schizophreniform symptom? E, deficit in non-communicative behavior? Number 9, a 10-year-old boy demonstrates hand clapping and finger flicking, and he repetitively flips coins and lines up his truck. He tends to echo the last several words of a question posed to him before answering, mixes up his pronouns, refers to himself as the second person, tends to repeat phrases in a perseverative fashion, and is quite fixated on routines related to dress, eating, travel, and play. He spends hours in his garage playing with his father's tools. What do these behaviors represent? Is it A, restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities characteristic of autism spectrum disorder? B, symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder? C, prototypical manifestation of obsessive-compulsive personality? D, symptom of pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome or PANS? Or letter E, complex tics? Number 10, a 25-year-old man presents with long-standing nonverbal communication deficit, inability to have a back-and-forth conversation or share interest in an appropriate fashion, and a complete lack of interest in having relationship with others. His speech reflects awkward phrasing and intonation and is mechanical in nature. He has a history of sequential fixations and obsessions with various games and objects throughout childhood. However, this is not currently a major issue for him. The patient meets criteria for autism spectrum disorder. Is it true or false? A, true, or B, false? Number 11. A 9-year-old girl presents with a history of intellectual impairment, a structural language impairment, nonverbal communication deficits, disinterest in peers, and inability to use language in a social manner. She has extreme food and tactile sensitivities. She is obsessed with one particular computer game that she plays for hours each day, and she scripts and imitates the characters in this game. She is clumsy, has an odd gait, and walks on her tiptoes. In the past year, she has developed a seizure disorder and has begun to bang her wrist against the wall repetitively, causing bruising. On the other hand, she plays several musical instruments in an extremely precocious manner, which features of child's clinical presentation fulfills a criterion symptom for DSM-5 autism spectrum disorder. Is it A, motor abnormalities, B, seizure, C, structural language impairment, D, intellectual impairment, or E, nonverbal communicative deficits? Number 12, an 11-year-old girl with autism spectrum disorder displays no spoken language and is minimally responsive to overtures from others. She can be somewhat inflexible, which interferes with her ability to travel, to do schoolwork, and be managed in the home. She has some difficulty transitioning and has trouble organizing and planning activities. These problems can usually be managed with incentives and reinforcers. What severity level should be specified in the DSM-5 diagnosis? Is it A, level 3, requiring very substantial support for social communication, and level 1, requiring support for restricted repetitive behavior? Letter B, level 1, requiring support for social communication, and level 3, requiring very substantial support for restricted repetitive behavior. Letter C, level 1, requiring support for social communication, and level 2, requiring substantial support for restricted repetitive behavior. Letter D, level 3, requiring very substantial support for social communication, and level 1, requiring support for restricted repetitive behavior. And letter E, level 2, requiring substantial support for social communication, and level 1, requiring support for restricted repetitive behavior. Number 13, which of the following is not a specifier included in the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder? Is it A, with or without accompanying intellectual impairment, B, with or without associated dementia, C, with or without accompanying language impairment, D, associated with a known medical or genetic condition or environmental factors, or letter E, associated with another neurodevelopmental, mental, or behavioral disorder? Number 14, which of the following is not characteristic of the developmental course of children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders? Is it A, behavioral features manifest before 3 years of age, B, the full symptom patterns does not appear until age 2 to 3 years, C, developmental plateaus or regression in social communicative behavior is frequent, reported by parents, letter D, regression across multiple domains occurs after age 2 to 3 years, and letter E, first symptoms often include delayed language development, lack of social interest, and unusual social behavior, odd play, and unusual communication patterns. And last, number 15. A 5-year-old girl has some mild food aversion. She enjoys having the same book read to her or book read to her at night but does not become terribly upset if her mother asks her to choose a different book. She occasionally spins around excitedly when her favorite show is on. She generally likes her toys neatly arranged in bins but is only mildly upset when her sister leaves them on the floor. This behavior should be considered suspicious for an autism spectrum disorder. True or false? Is it A, true, B, false? And now, let's proceed to answers and explanation. Number 1. Which of the following statements about global developmental delay is true? And the answer is letter A. The diagnosis typically made a child or children younger than 5 years of age. The diagnosis of global developmental delay is reserved for individuals under the age of 5 years who fail to meet expected developmental milestone in several areas of intellectual functioning, when the clinical severity level cannot be reliably assessed during early childhood. The diagnosis is used for individuals who are unable to undergo systematic assessment of intellectual functioning, including children who are too young to participate in standardized testing. Number 2, and the answer is letter D, global developmental delay. Although this girl's deficit may be suggestive of intellectual disability or intellectual developmental disorder, that diagnosis cannot be made in this case because information is lacking, like about age at onset of her symptoms, and she is too young to participate in standardized testing. At this point, there is no information to suggest that this child has dementia or major neurocognitive disorder, an autism spectrum disorder, no evidence of symptoms in the core of autism spectrum disorder categories, a specific disorder relating to coordination or specific areas of learning weaknesses which generally would not be able to be diagnosed until elementary years. Number 3, and the answer is letter B, deficit in nonverbal communicative behavior used for social interaction. DSM-5 Criterion A for Autism Spectrum Disorder specifies that all 3 symptom clusters summarized in options A, B, and C must be met. This boy's nonverbal communication is reported to be unimpaired, although this should be confirmed with a standardized instrument such as the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. Based on the current history, he could not be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder in DSM-5. Number 4, which of the following statement about development and course of autism spectrum disorder or ASD is false? And the answer is letter B. Symptoms of ASD are usually not noticeable until 5 to 6 years of age or later. Details about the age and patterns of onset are important and should be noted in the history. Symptoms of ASD are typically recognized during the second year of life or 12 to 24 months of age, but may be seen earlier than 12 months if developmental delays are severe, or noted later than 24 months if symptoms are more subtle. The pattern of onset description might include information about early developmental delays or any losses of social or language skills. Number 5, which of the following was a criterion symptom for autistic disorder in DSM-4 that was eliminated from the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder in DSM-5? And the answer is letter D, persistent preoccupation with parts of object. In DSM-5, the older requirement regarding objects was restated as follows: highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, like strong attachment to or preoccupation with unusual objects, excessively circumscribed or perseverative interest. In criterion B3, in criterion B4, DSM-5 mentions fascination with lights or spinning objects. There is no mention of preoccupation with parts of objects in DSM-5 criterion A3D in DSM-4 autistic disorder. Number 6, and the answer is letter B, autism spectrum disorder. This child may have met a criteria for Asperger's disorder or pervasive developmental disorder NOS or not otherwise specified in DSM-4. Autism spectrum disorder in DSM-5 subsume Asperger's disorder and pervasive developmental disorder NOS. Although the girl has intact formal language skills, it is the use of language for social communication that is particularly affected in autism spectrum disorder. A specific language delay is not required. Number 7, which of the following is not representative of the typical developmental course for autism spectrum disorder? And the answer is letter B, behavioral deterioration during adolescence. Most adolescents with autism spectrum disorder improve behaviorally. Only a minority further deteriorates. Number 8, and the answer is letter E, deficits in nonverbal communicative behavior. These symptoms are examples of deficits in nonverbal communicative behavior as described in criterion A2 for autism spectrum disorder criteria in DSM-5. Number 9, and the answer is letter A, restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities characteristic of autism spectrum disorder. In DSM-5, the symptom in the category of restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities, criterion B, associated with autism spectrum disorder, demonstrated by this patient include stereotype or repetitive motor movement, use of objects or speech, insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized pattern of verbal or nonverbal behavior, and highly restricted fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. Number 10, and the answer is true. This young man presents with all three symptoms in criterion A. His symptoms satisfy criterion C, which requires childhood onset, and he meets criterion D, which requires clinically significant impairment in functioning. Although he has only one symptom in criterion B, stereotype or repetitive speech, and the diagnosis requires 2, the fact that he has a history of fixation and obsession satisfies the criteria such that he does qualify for diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Number 11, and the answer is letter E, nonverbal communicative deficit. Criterion A for autism spectrum disorder lists nonverbal communicative deficits as one of the symptoms. The rest of the options represent associated features supporting diagnosis, which, according to DSM-5, notes that the gap between intellectual and adaptive functioning skills is often large. Number 12, and the answer is letter A. In DSM-5, severity is noted separately per social communication impairment and for the restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior. In the case, the social communication deficit are quite severe, warranting a classification of level 3, but the restricted, repetitive behaviors are milder, reflecting the lowest classification of level 1. Level 2 is an intermediate category, reflecting the need for substantial support. Number 13, which of the following is not a specifier included in the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder? And the answer is letter B, with or without associated dementia. The specifier with or without associated dementia is not included in the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. Number 14. Which of the following is not characteristic of the developmental course of children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder? And the answer is letter D. Regression across multiple domains occurs after age 2 to 3 years. Regression across multiple domains after age 2 to 3 may occur, but it is not typical of the developmental course in autism spectrum disorder. As noted in DSM-5, some children with autism spectrum disorder experience developmental plateaus or regression with a gradual or relatively rapid deterioration in social behavior or use of language, often during the first 2 years of life. Such losses are rare in other disorders and may be a useful red flag for autism spectrum disorder. And the last number, the answer is letter B, false. The girl described in the question meets none of the criteria for autism spectrum disorder because many typically developing young children have strong preference and enjoy repetition, like eating the same foods, watching the same video multiple times. Distinguishing restricted and repetitive behavior that are diagnostic of autism spectrum disorder can be difficult in preschoolers. The clinical distinction is based on the type, frequency, and intensity of the behavior, like a child who daily lines up objects for hours and is very distressed if any of them is moved. I hope you enjoyed and you learned a lot in this drill. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell for updates on our upcoming drills. Keep safe and have a nice day.